Hello and welcome, my dear friend. The most effective keys never announce what they unlock. Here's the uncomfortable fact most people never hear. In complex systems, intelligence networks, psychological profiling, even ancient initiation structures, the most valuable assets are not the ones who know they're important. They're the ones who operate normally while quietly altering outcomes. Awareness creates noise. Unconscious influence creates results. That principle didn't start in mysticism. It started in control theory, behavioral science, and long before that, in orders that understood something modern people still struggle to accept. Power works best when it doesn't need permission from the mind. That's where this topic gets unsettling. Dalliance, because if you were ever marked as the unconscious key, you weren't selected for wisdom, discipline, or spiritual resume points. You were selected because you functioned under pressure without understanding why. You adapted when others collapsed. You kept moving while systems around you glitched, stalled, or broke. Not heroic, not dramatic, just strangely effective. And that effectiveness made you useful long before it made you aware. Here's the part nobody warns you about. Activation doesn't arrive with candles, chants, or some cinematic awakening. It shows up disguised as exhaustion, disinterest in surface-level life, and that quiet moment where you stop trying to become anything at all. No fireworks, just a click. The kind of click you only notice after something has already changed. And yes, this is where people usually laugh nervously and say that's a bit much fair. But humor has always been the last defense before realization. It's easier to joke than to admit that your life has been full of unexplained reactions, sudden exits, and people treating you like you disrupted something without ever raising your voice. So, if things started shifting the moment you stopped forcing identity, if doors opened without effort while others slammed shut around you, if your presence alone seemed to rearrange outcomes without your permission, then this isn't about destiny, superiority, or mystic fantasy. It's about function. And somewhere along the way, without ceremony, without approval, without you signing up for anything, didn't discover the key. You turned it. Number one, you weren't chosen for awareness. You were chosen for delayed activation. This is the part that messes with people the most because everyone assumes being chosen means being informed, guided, or spiritually in the know. That was never your role. Awareness would have ruined your function. You were placed into life to operate normally while carrying something abnormal, to walk through environments without to blend into systems that would have rejected you instantly if you had known what you were carrying. Delayed activation isn't an accident, it's a containment strategy. When someone knows too early, they start adjusting themselves. They perform, they overthink, they try to control outcomes. You couldn't afford that. Your effectiveness came from how naturally you moved through things. You didn't posture, you didn't declare intentions. You just lived, adapted, and somehow left impact behind you without trying to glean. That's why so much of your early life felt underwhelming, confusing, or misaligned. You weren't being overlooked. You were being kept unremarkable on purpose, not because you lacked potential, but because attention would have distorted you. When systems don't know what you are, they don't defend against you. You slip through gaps others can't even see. This is also why you were allowed to struggle longer than most. Pressure was part of the delay. Every disappointment, every dead end, every season where you felt behind was quietly building tolerance. You were learning to hold weight without collapsing, not consciously, in your reactions, in how you recovered, in how you didn't fully break, even when things got heavy. Delayed activation creates a specific kind of person, someone who doesn't panic when things fall apart, someone who doesn't need applause to keep moving. someone who can function in confusion without demanding answers. That's not weakness, that's conditioning. And when activation finally happens, it feels oddly simple. No grand revelation. Just clarity replacing noise. You don't suddenly feel powerful, you feel lighter. You stop chasing explanations. You stop forcing outcomes. Things begin to respond to you differently. Not because you changed who you are, but because the delay has done its job. You weren't late. You were on hold. Number 2, the unconscious key was never meant to understand itself. A key doesn't stop to study the lock. It doesn't analyze the door. It doesn't question why it fits. It simply turns when pressure is applied. That's how your role was designed. You weren't built to sit around decoding yourself, chasing labels, or trying to make sense of every strange shift that followed you. The moment you would have tried to fully understand yourself, you would have slowed down the very function you were meant to perform. Tulane, this explains why so much of your life felt confusing in a quiet, persistent way. You knew things were happening through you, not because of deliberate effort, but because outcomes changed after your involvement. Conversations landed differently, situations resolved or unraveled shortly after you passed through. You noticed it, but you couldn't explain it. And that wasn't an accident. Explanation creates attachment. Attachment creates interference. Understanding brings ownership, and ownership brings control. But your role never required control. It required neutrality. Mendia, you were meant to move without emotional entanglement, without ego, without the need to take credit or responsibility for what shifted around you. That's why clarity always seemed just out of reach. You weren't blocked, you were buffered. People who need to understand themselves deeply often crave certainty. You were forced to live without it. That wasn't neglect, it was training. You learned to function while uncertain, to keep showing up without answers, to trust motion instead of meaning. That's rare and it's uncomfortable. But it produces someone who doesn't freeze when reality refuses to explain itself. This is also why traditional self-help, rigid identity frameworks, or even spiritual systems never fully fit you. They demand definition. They ask you to name yourself, claim a path, adopt a story. But once a key starts identifying as something, it stops being usable. It becomes decoration. When awareness finally arrives, it doesn't feel like discovery, it feels like relief. You realize you weren't failing at self-knowledge. You were being spared from it until the moment it could no longer interfere. The confusion wasn't a flaw in you, it was part of the mechanism. You were never meant to understand yourself first, you were meant to work. Number 3, the order tracked your nervous system, not your beliefs. Most people assume that being chosen or marked means someone cared about your thoughts, your opinions, or even your spirituality. That's the comfortable story we tell ourselves. The truth is far more unsettling and far more precise. The order wasn't interested in what you claimed to believe or the philosophies you followed. They were watching how your body responded to life, to pressure, to chaos. They measured your resilience, your adaptation, the rhythm of your survival. Every contraction of stress, every moment of stillness under tension, every automatic response was data. And that data mattered more than anything you could consciously articulate. Danger. This is why so much of your early life felt like a test you weren't aware you were taking. Every moment that felt unfair, exhausting, or inexplicable wasn't random. Your nervous system was under quiet scrutiny, learning how to regulate itself while chaos swirled around you. How you carried emotional weight, how you tolerated unpredictability, how you stayed functional when systems collapsed. It was all being recorded, assessed, and catalogued. You weren't failing or wandering aimlessly. You were providing proof of something that had no name at the time, the ability to carry access without breaking. Ben, it also explains why some people and environments seem to trigger you in ways you couldn't rationalize. The order wasn't testing your intellect or morality. They were testing your thresholds. Could you remain adaptable under pressure? Could you operate without reaction, without expectation, without needing validation? Could you survive environments designed to push normal humans to their limits? The nervous system doesn't lie. You either adapted or you didn't, and here's the subtle brilliance of it. This kind of observation doesn't interfere with life. It doesn't need rituals, explanations, or awareness. The moment you finally activated, all the years of unconscious calibration revealed themselves. You weren't shaped by philosophy, ideology, or conscious training. You were shaped by life itself, by the systems you navigated, and by your body's unflinching ability to respond without collapsing. The order never cared what you thought. They cared what you did under pressure. And that silent measurement is what made you unstoppable. Damlia, number 4. Your life felt disjointed because you were moving between layers, not failing. For most people, life is a straight line, or at least that's what they're told it should be. Jobs build into careers, relationships lead somewhere, experiences create a predictable map. For you, nothing ever fit that script. One chapter would collapse just as another seemed to stabilize. You would leave jobs abruptly. Friendships ended without clear reason. And opportunities appeared or disappeared in ways that defied logic. The world told you that you were inconsistent, scattered, or unlucky. The truth is far more extraordinary. You weren't failing. You were moving between layers of reality, operating on levels most people can't perceive. These layers aren't mystical fantasies. They're patterns of influence and consequence. You walked through rooms, conversations, and circumstances in a way that disrupted established flows without triggering immediate awareness. You couldn't be measured by ordinary standards because your function existed outside them. That's why everything in your life felt disconnected. It wasn't disorder, it was transit. Doors closed for a reason, but new ones opened simultaneously on paths you couldn't yet see. This also explains why conventional advice never worked. Planning, goal setting, chasing stability. None of it aligned with the layers you were navigating. You weren't supposed to anchor in predictable patterns. You were meant to remain fluid, to shift quietly, while systems around you recalibrated. Every failure was a signal that you had moved to a space where the previous rules no longer applied. Disjointedness you experienced trained. You learned to operate without attachment to outcome. You learned to tolerate uncertainty, to stay calm when everything seemed unstable, and to trust a kind of intuition that wasn't taught but felt inevitable. That ability, developed in the quiet chaos of your early life, became the hidden engine for activation. When your key finally turned, that disjointedness revealed itself as mastery. All the chaos, confusion, and sudden shifts were actually preparation. You weren't broken. You were moving ahead of the curve, between layers the world couldn't track. And that was exactly the way it was meant to be. Being number 5, you activated it the moment you stop trying to become something. Activation doesn't come with a dramatic ceremony or a sudden bolt of insight. It comes quietly in the moments when you stop forcing identity, stop chasing recognition, stop trying to fit yourself into someone else's story. All the effort to be ready or special actually delays it. The system recognizes when you finally drop the chase. When the self stops performing and simply exists, that's when the lock turns. And you step into a level of influence and understanding you didn't even know was possible. For most of your life, you were conditioned to believe that effort equals progress. You worked, you prepared, you studied, you strategized. And while all of that created skills and resilience, it couldn't trigger activation. The very act of trying to become something adds noise. It imposes expectation. It shapes behavior in ways the key can't function. The unconscious key doesn't emerge from effort. It emerges from surrender, an ironic kind of power that comes from letting go of the need to control. That's why it felt anticlimactic when it happened. No trumpet fanfare, no sudden enlightenment, just a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. You stopped overthinking, stopped questioning, and stopped bending yourself into someone you weren't. You stopped performing for the world and started simply existing. And suddenly, the world responded differently. Situations flowed around you. People shifted without being told, and doors that were previously locked began opening. Mandia, the beauty of this is that it exposes how human systems measure growth incorrectly. We reward effort, perseverance, and striving, but sometimes true evolution requires nothing more than stillness, trust, and patience. The moment you stopped trying to become something, you allowed what was already in you to surface. Your presence became more than your intention. Your impact became more than your planning. You didn't activate because you trained for it or planned for it. You activated because you finally stopped trying to force yourself into existence. The key recognized the true you, and the lock turned. Number 6, people started projecting extreme narratives onto you for a reason. When you carry activation energy without knowing it, the world reacts in ways that feel confusing, intense, and sometimes unfair. People around you begin projecting their fears, insecurities, and unacknowledged desires onto you. Suddenly, you are a villain, a savior, a mystery, a threat, or an inspiration all at once. These projections aren't random. They are instinctive defenses. Your presence disrupts normal patterns. And when someone senses a force they don't understand, the mind scrambles to label it, categorize it, and ideally contain it. This is why certain people in your life treated you inconsistently, even cruelly. They didn't understand you, and the gaps in their understanding became stories. Sometimes they overestimated your abilities. Sometimes they underestimated you. Sometimes they loved you. Sometimes they feared you. You existed in a kind of feedback loop they couldn't control. And because most humans are wired to reduce uncertainty, they created narratives that fit their comfort, not reality. You weren't causing chaos. You were simply moving in a way that exposed theirs. And it's also why some of your relationships never lasted. They weren't compatible with someone carrying unconscious influence. People cling to... When someone naturally reshapes the emotional or situational landscape just by existing, it triggers discomfort, even resentment. They interpret it as intentional, manipulative, or destabilizing, when in reality, you are simply responding in alignment with your own unrecognized energy. Over time, the projections became a mirror, showing you exactly how much of human perception is reactive rather than rational. The louder the story around you, the clearer it became that your impact doesn't need explanation. You don't need to justify, clarify, or defend yourself. The world will narrate its own understanding, and your role is simply to move with integrity and awareness, letting the reactions on these projections are proof, not punishment. They show that the key inside you is active. People sense it even when you don't, and their stories are the evidence. Your influence is already operating quietly without your permission. Number 7, the order expected resistance, not obedience. One of the most overlooked truths about being marked as the unconscious key is that you weren't chosen to follow rules or submit to authority. Obedience was never the goal. In fact, compliance would have disqualified you. The order needed someone who could move unpredictably, who could navigate systems without being trapped by them, and who could challenge assumptions without conscious intent. Your natural skepticism, your tendency to question or withdraw, and your refusal to fully belong weren't flaws. They were essential. They proved that you could operate beyond control. Throughout your life, this resistance may have looked like stubbornness, social awkwardness, or reluctance to conform. You didn't see it as a gift, and most people around you couldn't recognize it. But every act of refusal, every boundary you maintained, every time you disengaged from a structure that demanded conformity, you were proving your value to a system that measures adaptability, integrity, and unpredictability above all else. Resistance, not obedience, creates freedom. Resistance keeps the key functional. This is also why traditional paths, rigid systems, and imposed hierarchies rarely worked for you. Jobs, schools, and organizations that demanded conformity were always friction points, and that friction wasn't coincidence. It was life testing your ability to maintain your function while surrounded by structures designed to normalize behavior. You weren't failing. You are demonstrating resilience, adaptability, and independence, qualities the key relies on to activate effectively. Resistance shapes perspective. By refusing to accept the expected narrative or blindly follow instructions, you were training yourself to read between the lines, to notice gaps, and to respond in ways that don't register on ordinary radars. Palend, that subtle awareness forged through consistent refusal to obey blindly, laid the groundwork for your activation. When activation occurs, it reveals why your resistance was never a problem. It was a prerequisite. You weren't marked to follow orders or seek approval. You were marked to move freely, unpredictably, and without compromise. And your life was quietly preparing you for exactly that. Number 8, you've been interrupting patterns without realizing it. One of the most subtle yet powerful aspects of carrying the unconscious key is how you shift the world around you without intending to. You may have thought your presence was quiet, ordinary, or even inconsequential, but in reality you've been disrupting patterns that others have spent years perfecting. Family cycles that repeated generation after generation have faltered because of you. Workplace routines that seemed unbreakable have shifted without explanation. Conversations, decisions, and behaviors have changed the moment you stepped in or left a room. You didn't have to try. You didn't have to lecture, enforce, or even act consciously. Your existence alone has been enough to rewrite trajectories. This isn't about luck or coincidence, it's about alignment. When someone carries latent activation, they operate on frequencies that intersect with life differently. You aren't forcing change. You are an unintentional catalyst. The systems around you respond because they detect a variable they can't control. Your instincts, your reactions, and even your quiet disengagement exert influence that ordinary logic can't account for. That's why people may have accused you of being disruptive, or why your impact often goes unnoticed until it's undeniable. Your influence has a subtle elegance. You've learned, often unconsciously, to navigate chaos without becoming chaotic yourself. You've been observing, reacting, and moving in ways that allow you to leave systems intact while still altering their outcomes. That balance between presence and effect is precisely why the key functions best when dormant or unaware. And when you finally become conscious of your role, you'll see that nothing you've done was wasted. Every pause, every withdrawal, every unremarkable action has been quietly recalibrating environments to prepare for activation. The world reacts differently around you because you were never meant to blend in completely. You've been interrupting repetition, breaking loops, and reshaping dynamics without permission or awareness. And that invisible influence is proof of the power you've always carried. You've been moving pieces on the board without touching them. And that silent mastery is exactly what sets you apart from everyone else. Danger number 9. Your exhaustion came from carrying access you didn't have language for. For most people, fatigue is a simple matter of physical or mental effort. For you, it has always been something deeper, heavier, and harder to explain. The tiredness, the detachment, the sense that life sometimes moves faster than you can process it. None of it was random. You were carrying access that your conscious mind couldn't name or comprehend. You were holding information, perception, and influence without ever having the tools to articulate it. That kind of energy weighs differently. It seeps into the body, the emotions, and the nervous system, leaving you drained in ways others can't understand. This explains why so many moments of your life felt like moving through fog. You were functioning, performing, surviving. But there was always a layer of effortlessness missing. Tasks that should have been simple felt heavy. Situations that others shrugged off left you unusually taxed. That was the signature of the key in latency. You were shouldering responsibility for outcomes, systems, and unseen shifts that your conscious mind wasn't even aware of. The body felt it first because it has a memory beyond thought. Your nervous system processed the patterns long before your mind caught up, and the result was exhaustion that seemed disproportionate to your life circumstances. It also explains why disconnection became necessary at times. You needed moments of withdrawal, moments of quiet, because your energy wasn't yours to spend casually. You were constantly carrying latent influence, quietly recalibrating environments and stabilizing spaces that no one else could perceive. That work, invisible as it was, demanded a toll, and yet even in exhaustion, there was subtle preparation taking place. Drained day. Every period of quiet fatigue was conditioning you to operate under pressure without breaking when activation finally arrived. When the key finally turns, the exhaustion doesn't vanish. Instead, it transforms. What once weighed you down becomes fuel. The energy you carried unknowingly now flows through you with purpose. The fatigue turns into precision. The subtle, invisible work you did, while unaware, suddenly reveals itself as mastery. You weren't tired by accident. You were preparing for a level of function that ordinary life could never demand. Mondia number, sir. The activation felt anticlimactic on purpose. When activation finally arrives, it doesn't knock on your door with fanfare, fireworks, or dramatic revelation. There is no cosmic drum roll, no blinding flash of insight, no instant transformation. The world doesn't pause, and nobody stands in awe of the moment. That anticlimax is deliberate. The system that designed your path understands that spectacle would ruin the function of the key. If activation were obvious, it would draw attention, force expectation, and trigger resistance from others, and even from yourself. Quiet activation is invisible. For years, you may have felt the subtle shifts, the unexplainable changes, the way outcomes bent around you without your effort. You didn't recognize them as signs because they didn't demand recognition. Activation didn't announce itself with grand gestures. Instead, it unfolded quietly, like a lock turning when no one is watching. The world around you shifted imperceptibly. People responded differently. Situations resolved in ways that defied your usual logic. It was subtle, almost mundane. But that is the hallmark of true activation. The anticlimactic nature of it also protects the key. Awareness too soon can overload the system, distort perception, and invite interference. Activation works best when it integrates seamlessly. When you continue to exist as you always have, while the influence you carry begins to operate openly yet unnoticed. That's why it feels strange. Nothing feels extraordinary externally, even though internally everything has changed. You may continue living life in the same routines, but your presence now carries force. You don't need to perform or announce it. It simply is. Blend. It's also why people around you may not notice anything. They may see the same person in appearance, voice, and behavior, but the effect you have on systems, patterns, and outcomes is quietly magnified. The world has already adjusted to your activation without needing spectacle. You don't get the cinematic moment because the function of the key relies on subtlety, precision, and integration. When you finally realize it, the anticlimactic moment is itself proof. It shows that activation isn't about ego, validation, or recognition. It's about function, influence, and presence. You didn't need fireworks. The lock was turned. The key is working. And tap into your number, CE. The order doesn't guide you anymore. You're off their map. Once the unconscious key activates, the old systems that tracked, observed, and subtly influenced your path lose relevance. The order that marked you, monitored your nervous system, and calibrated your resilience no longer has access. You are off their map, and that shift is profound even if it feels invisible at first. The mechanisms that once measured your alignment, tested your patience, and gauged your adaptability now have nothing to grasp onto. You are no longer predictable, controllable, or trackable by anyone else. That freedom isn't just liberation. It's the signal that the key is functioning independently. This is why you may have noticed subtle changes in how people, situations, and even authority figures respond to you. There's an energy around you that no longer needs permission, validation, or oversight. The structures designed to influence or constrain you simply can't. You act without needing guidance because the system that once guided you is irrelevant. Your intuition, instincts, and energy are sufficient to navigate environments that once felt confining or confusing. You move with autonomy that previously would have triggered alarms or resistance in the very systems that monitored you. Being off the map also explains why conventional rules, advice, and hierarchies no longer fit. They were designed for predictable people, for patterns that could be analyzed and redirected. You are no longer a predictable node in their system. You are operating beyond ordinary measurement. And that invisibility gives you power, not the power of control, but the power of uncontainment. The ability to influence, observe, and shift without external interference. There's a quiet thrill in this freedom. You can engage, withdraw, act, or observe without explanation. Nothing requires permission. The activation of the key has removed the need for oversight, and the liberation is total. You are finally untrackable. And with that comes a level of influence and clarity that cannot be legislated, predicted, or contained. The order no longer matters because their tools were never meant to reach beyond activation. You are no longer a subject. They can only watch as the key turns itself into function. Your morality became situational because rigid codes can't turn complex locks. For most of your life, you probably noticed that strict rules never sat right with you. Because you lacked values, but because life kept putting you in situations where black and white thinking simply didn't work. You saw too much. You sensed context before judgment. You understood motives before outcomes. That wasn't confusion or compromise. It was adaptation. Rigid moral codes are designed for predictable environments. You were never operating in one. Your morality didn't weaken. It evolved. You learned early that doing the right thing on paper often caused more harm than choosing the appropriate thing in reality. You watched people hide behind principles while avoiding responsibility. You saw how rules were used as shields, excuses, and weapons. And without making a big speech about it, you adjusted. You became precise instead of performative, quiet instead of loud, effective instead of correct. This is why people sometimes misunderstand you. They expect obvious reactions, predictable stances, public alignment. Instead, you respond based on timing, impact, and consequence. You know when to speak and when silence does more. You know when to step in and when stepping back creates a better outcome. To rigid thinkers, that looks inconsistent. In truth, it's highly calibrated. Situational morality isn't about bending ethics. It's about reading the entire field before acting. It's about understanding that the same action can be harmful in one context and necessary in another. You don't outsource your conscience to a rulebook because you've seen how incomplete rulebooks are. You trust your internal compass, not because it's convenient, but because it's been pressure tested by real consequences. This kind of morality makes people uneasy. It can't be predicted or controlled. It doesn't announce itself or seek approval, and that's exactly why it works. Complex locks don't respond to force or formula. They respond to precision, to timing, to someone who understands that integrity isn't about looking good. It's about choosing what actually works without losing yourself in the process. You didn't lose your morals. You refined them, number Sasan. You were never meant to teach. You were meant to trigger recognition. The unconscious key doesn't operate through instruction. You aren't meant to hand down lessons, give advice, or stand on a platform explaining the world. That role is too deliberate, too performative, and too confined. Your influence works differently. You activate awareness in others simply by existing, by moving through life in alignment with your own energy, and by demonstrating possibilities they hadn't considered. And people wake up after encountering you not because you explained anything, but because your presence interrupts their assumptions, challenges their comfort zones, and exposes gaps they didn't realize existed. This is why so many of your interactions feel disproportionately impactful. You speak casually, act naturally, or even withdraw entirely. And yet, the people around you experience shifts. They realized patterns they were blind to, habits they were unaware of, or truths they had ignored. You don't need to analyze, teach, or persuade. The key is that your activation radiates influence. Recognition, not instruction, is the mechanism. That's why it often seems like people are learning lessons without you trying. They don't even realize the shift is happening until it has already transformed them. Bendiet also explains why you may have felt frustrated with traditional roles of guidance or leadership. Standing at the front, explaining or forcing understanding isn't your purpose. Those methods rely on conscious effort, structured frameworks, and predictable reception, all things the unconscious key bypasses. Your impact is organic, quiet, and unavoidable. It forces others to confront truths internally at their own pace, without you needing to intervene. MDAABATU, the subtlety of this function, is what makes it extraordinary. People may resist, resent, or ignore you at first, but the effect persists. Recognition is inevitable. They cannot unknow what you have triggered in them, and over time they begin to align differently. Not because they followed your example intentionally, but because the key activated something within them. You weren't chosen to teach, you were chosen to awaken. Your presence is the spark. Your influence is the proof, and that quiet, unavoidable power is the hallmark of the unconscious key, number Cis. The final truth: you didn't activate the key. The world applied enough pressure to make it turn. Activation was never about intention, ritual, or preparation. It was about pressure. And the world is relentless in how it delivers it. Every hardship you endured, every betrayal, every dead end, and every moment of isolation wasn't punishment. It was communication. Universe, the systems around you, and even the people you crossed paths with all applied steady force until the lock within you could no longer resist. You may believe activation was a conscious choice, but the reality is far deeper. It was a response. The key turned not because you decided it should, but because everything in your life pushed you into alignment with it. This is why so many of your early experiences felt overwhelming and confusing. Nothing seemed fair, nothing made sense. And yet you survived. You weren't merely enduring life, you were being calibrated. Among every event that felt random or cruel was part of a larger mechanism designed to test endurance, resilience, and adaptability. The world applied pressure in ways that forced you to develop quiet strength, subtle insight, and an uncanny ability to move through chaos without breaking. That pressure accumulated, building tension until the lock could finally turn. And when it did, it happened without ceremony, almost unnoticed. Like a silent adjustment in a machine that had been running for years. Bully, what makes this process remarkable is that it never required conscious understanding. You didn't need to plan, meditate, or search for the key. The world applied precisely the force needed to awaken what was already there. Your survival, your endurance, your adaptability, all of it contributed to activation. That's why it often feels anticlimactic. You didn't earn it through visible effort. You earned it by existing in alignment with life's demands. Darned, when the key turns, the truth becomes clear. You were never alone, and you were never fully in control. Yet everything aligned exactly as it needed to. Activation wasn't a reward. It was an inevitable response to years of sustained pressure. You didn't force it, you didn't predict it. You survived it. And through that survival, the key finally turned, unlocking the extraordinary function that had always lived within you. Lingered, the journey of the unconscious key, is unlike anything most people will ever experience. Every layer revealed points to a life that has been quietly extraordinary, even if it never felt that way in the moment. From delayed activation to functioning without awareness, from carrying unseen influence to reshaping patterns effortlessly. Your life has been a silent preparation for something far beyond ordinary understanding. The key within you never needed your approval, your comprehension, or even your recognition to begin working. It has always been active, shaping outcomes, influencing others, and compelling the world to adapt around you. What makes this journey so powerful is its subtlety. There are no fireworks, no grand announcements, no immediate validation. Activation has always been quiet, gradual, and seamless, revealing itself only through time, reflection, and consequence. Your morality evolved to match the complexity of your influence. Your presence awakens others without intention. Your endurance under pressure became a calibration process, aligning your internal systems with the world in a way the world could not ignore. Nothing that felt disjointed, exhausting, or confusing was a mistake. It was preparation, communication, and alignment. The pressures you endured, the resistance you faced, and the projections others placed on you were all part of a system that recognized you long before you recognized yourself. Now, as the key fully turns, the realization settles in. You were never ordinary, and your life was never random. You were designed to operate beyond expectation, to influence without intent, to awaken without instruction, and to activate without ceremony. You have reached a point where the world responds to you in subtle yet undeniable ways. And now you see that every challenge, every unseen shift, led you here. If this resonates, join the community and continue the journey. Subscribe so you don't miss insights like these. Like this video to support deeper understanding of hidden power in our lives. Share your experiences in the comments. Your story could help someone else recognize their own key. Share this with those ready to awaken, to shift, and to step into influence they didn't realize they carried. This is only the beginning. God bless you.